Uh, I thank Mr. D'Souza for moving this motion and for the members in giving their views and supporting generally the very strong stand that we take. I think this motion is a timely reminder for us to really remain vigilant, continue to be tough on drugs, and make this a national priority. As we debate the way forward, what do we do next? Mr. Pritam Singh talked about international currents. Others talked about the mood within Singapore, young people. As we assess how we move forward, I think it's useful for members to understand a little bit about how the history of fight against drugs evolved and really look at the period between the 60s to the 80s. In a snapshot, what did we have then? We had high crime rates. We had abusers stealing, committing crimes to feed their addiction. We had traffickers exploiting the abusers' dependence. We had broken families. If I gave some numbers, I think members will be shocked. And I will give some numbers in a minute. To tackle this, CNB was set up in 1971. It doesn't predate 1971. We saw it as a menace, and we said we have to fight it. Which is why in every speech I make, I emphasize it is not a single solution, not just the death penalty. It is a whole suite of factors. So CNB was set up, empowered. The legislative framework was put in through the MDA in 1973. And then Operation Ferret launched to reverse the momentum. You can guess from the name what it meant. So CNB, the police force, they coordinated their efforts, flushed out the abusers. If we had not done that, the law and order situation today in Singapore that we take for granted will be very different. In the early 1970s, mark this, we were arresting less than 10 heroin abusers a year. We could have kidded ourselves and believed that was a true situation. But after we set up CNB, and after we started Operation Ferret, by February 1978, 26,000 abusers had been arrested. That is the picture before and after. So for people outside this House, and for the Honorable Nominated Member of Parliament who advocates a softer approach, suggests that our laws are too tough, remember these figures. When you don't enforce, you get one picture, 26,000 people by 1978. In the 1980s, we still had more than 8,000 in DRC. And in 1993, our recidivism rate, DRC recidivism rate, was 73%. That is where we were, and today, everyone accepts, even the economist accepts, that we have the drug situation under control. Perhaps the only country to be able to say that openly and directly and backed up by the facts. And we set up a committee to improve the drug situation. That was in November 1993 with a comprehensive anti-drug strategy. Preventive drug education in the schools, tough laws, backed up by tough enforcement, rehabilitation, aftercare. It's a whole context of factors. So that is the background. We have had a good run for 20 years. But now consider the global situation and how that might impact on us. UNODC estimates 2014 that there are nearly 250 million drug abusers in the world. 250 million. And 200,000 died from drug-related causes. And that probably does not include the type of cases that Mr. D'Souza talked about, where people under the influence of drugs cause traffic accidents and kill others. These are people who died as a result of drug abuse, 200,000. And Mr. Pritam Singh is right. The global conversation is about a softer stance on drugs. Seductive arguments using pseudoscience and glamorizing drugs, and they do create a challenging environment for us to create or keep Singapore drug-free. But if you look at evidence, you look at the US, this opioid abuse, the prescriptions went up threefold since 1999, fueled by people relying on and accepting questionable evidence that these are benign pain remedies, that these are, and going into diversions and misuse. Thousands get hooked onto it, and then guess what happens? They move on to heroin. Now you get, New York Times publishes, 33,000 deaths per year, 50 a day. For those with bleeding hearts who talk about the inmates in the death row, I think they should think about these 33,000 deaths. What percentage do you want in Singapore? What about their families, their children? Why not spend some time with them rather than just crying with the people in the death row? This is, as Mr. D'Souza pointed out, the trafficker is engaging in a crime of cynicism or crime with cynicism for profit. He knows what he is doing. He is coming in for money, and there is nothing on the spur about it. The same arguments that were used to try and get opium allowed is now being used for cannabis legislation. The arguments, if you look at them, evocative, but little clinical evidence. And there is some suggestion, Mr. Singh talked about it, others talked about it, how people are now going into medical marijuana and medical cannabis and so on. You know, I said at the United Nations, I don't want human rights groups preaching to me about the medical value of cannabis. If a respectable medical association is prepared to tell me that this ought to be prescribed as medicine, we will look at it. And what does the American Medical Association say? That there is no proven record for this. There can be no objection to any substance being prescribed by a doctor based on scientific evidence. I think there is every objection to a blanket legislation allowing free use of cannabis or opium on the basis of some questionable medical suggestion, which no medical association worth its salt is prepared to back up. So Mr. Pritam Singh is right. Legalization around the world is gaining ground. He quoted Malaysia. He quoted Thailand. He quoted Israel. But my point is, I think a large majority of Singaporeans stand by what is right, stand by our position, and even internationally. When I went to the UN, we brought along a doctor who had poured through a substantial amount of medical literature on the substance abuse, cannabis abuse in particular, and was prepared to stand up and present that this is the impact cannabis has on your brain structure, and it makes you dependent. That's the medical evidence. Now, Science is always evolving, and if science evolves to a different stage, we are practical people and we rely on facts. But today, this is a science. But I thank Mr. Singh for the strong stand he took in terms of supporting the position we take in Singapore against drugs. Mr. D'Souza pointed out how drug abuse has worsened in Colorado since they legalized cannabis. And it is serious. And who is pushing it? Who is pushing it? The pharma companies are pushing it. Why? It's obvious why. Even when we go to these international conferences, the NGOs which support legalization come out with brochures which are glitzy, which are very attractive, evocative. They're all financed by the pharma companies. Those who oppose legalization, those who take a stand similar to Singapore's, if you look at the material, you wouldn't want to look at them again, because no one is financing them. There is a huge commercial motive for legalization, and that's driving this in many countries. There are other factors. Many countries have lost the fight. They cannot control domestic drug abuse, and so after having lost tens of thousands of lives, they move to focusing on public health issues, HIV. So you get an alliance within commercial interests and countries saying, we can't handle this anymore. And they are now saying, let's create a new international norm. I mean, I don't have a problem if they change their rules, but I do have a problem if they want to change international norms and say every country should follow that. And we will not be pressured.